Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Connected Learning TV on air. We're here at Educator Innovator, and I'm your host for this hangout, Christina Cantrell at the National Writing Project. I'm super excited to talk today with some colleagues about a project called Twist Fate. This project started in 2016 with the provocation, with a small twist of fate, any hero could become a villain, and any villain a hero. It was a month-long challenge for youth, ages 13 to 17, and it kicked off during YALSA, the Young Adult Library Services Association, during YALSA's Teen Tech Week. So now it's actually a beautiful book. You see that okay? It's also an online collection. You can find it at clalliance.org/twist-fate. And it's a project that Mimi Ito, one of the people who coordinated, calls an unprecedented experiment in connecting across stories, platforms, and generations. It was also a really exciting collaboration. It brought together the National Writing Project with YALSA, as well as the Connected Learning Alliance, and then also two communities of practice, DeviantArt and Wattpad. You can check it out online, as I said. Just search for Twist Fate and Connected Learning Alliance, and I'm sure you'll find it. And the entire volume is available to read online and is also downloadable. These physical copies of the book have been distributed to writing projects and libraries across the country. And you can also see people talking about this work at the hashtag Twist Fate, and we'll send out some resources connected to this conversation there too. I'm super excited to talk today with colleagues Antero Garcia and Sarah Ryan, who both acted as judges for this project, but also curators. So I'm really excited to talk to them about what they saw in it, what they learned, and what they're really excited about, and some of the wonderful work that youth put together in this process. So thank you both for being here.
Glad to be here.
Let's see. So now I've shared the basics. I sort of thought, let's get to talk more about the underlying ideas and the purposes that drove this project about Twist Fate. So maybe you could tell us who you are, how you participated in this project, and how you might describe this project to someone who is asking about it.
Okay. So my name's Sarah Ryan, and I write books and comics for teens and others is how I usually describe it. And I also work as a librarian with teens. And I would say that it's a project that is a way to just explore a lot of different fandoms. These are all, almost all of the art and writing is based on existing worlds. There are a couple that are totally original, but otherwise it's taking existing stories and putting a new spin on them.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'd add to that. So I'm an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford University. Used to be a former, or am a former English teacher. I guess that's not a used to be. That's just what it is. And I think, to me, this was kind of the coolest professional thing I've gotten to do, right? Because basically it just meant getting to read a bunch of really cool takes on existing canons and pushing on the stories that meant a lot to the people who contributed to this volume. And I guess as adults, I felt like we were interlopers, right? Like these were fan communities on Wattpad and DeviantArt that were largely speaking to one another. And if you dig into the original entries, you see conversation with each other. And we got to just kind of curate and pick from an abundance of amazing work. So it was really a privilege just to be able to recognize the kind of ingenuity and brilliance of young people as an inspiration that I think we're able to get from that work.
That's great, Antero. And I was also thinking about that just from the National Writing Project, as an organization, getting to connect, and someone working on this project getting connect and even get to know DeviantArt and Wattpad as a community of practice was really exciting. And I realized that I didn't we didn't say anything about those two communities, so I just wanted to give some basic information. So DeviantArt dates back to 2000 and is considered one of the oldest and largest online social networks for artists and art enthusiasts. I think what's also important about it is a platform for publishing and sharing the work. They say they have 40 million people registered and attract more than 60 million unique visitors per month. So it's an incredibly active and engaged community. Wattpad connects a community of about 45 million people around the world, and they say they connect people through serialized stories about the things that they love, which I think is a lovely way to say it. It considers itself a home for fresh voices and for fans who share culturally relevant stories based on local trends and current events. So also for me professionally, it was just fascinating to sort of get to know these communities and get sort of a view into what people were doing there. And yeah, it felt a little bit like an interloper and also sort of a place that really put me in a position of being a learner. So one of the things that I thought we could do today, sort of in that vein of being a learner, is actually just start with some of the stuff that people created and some of the work that we were really excited about. And I know you guys curated the overall volume. Actually, before we share the work, maybe, do you want to give some context for how the curation happened and a little bit of that background, and then we can look at some of the specifics of the work?
You want to start?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think entries, and maybe I'll get this wrong, but I think across both platforms, entries were submitted by using the twist fate hashtag to kind of signal that they were submitted to either to Wattpad or DeviantArt, and were then entered in for us to look at. And there are a lot of entries, and so really the judging process of this meant just getting to read and view and eventually talk about a bunch of examples, or a bunch of the entries, and a lot of them ended up in both the PDF and the bound book, right? And so really this is a curation of one part of it, right? So if we were to go and look at the originals on DeviantArt, you would see a comment thread and you would be able to click on the user, on the person who created this material, and just want to recognize that, like, in distilling this into this kind of medium, we've taken away that professional community that it is immersed in. And it's not a bad thing, right? It's adhering to the genres of a book, and that's necessary. But it's really important to think about how this is ingrained. Exactly. Looking at Christina's screen, how this is ingrained in DeviantArt as a community, and as a community of professional artists are on there, right? There's nothing that differentiates, I think, to me, either in quality or in content, that the work that the young people in this book were doing, and the participants and the people who just use DeviantArt on a day-to-day basis.
And I would say too that because in part that DeviantArt has been around for so long, I know a lot of professional artists who got their start in that kind of community, whether it was DeviantArt itself or another platform for sharing your art online. And so there really is, like Antara was saying, you can be, it's one of the places I think that you still can be, a 13-year-old who is regularly interacting with professionals who might be, who might have been around on DeviantArt since 2000. And similarly with Wattpad, I know that Wattpad has some connections with publishers where they're finding content from the Wattpad community and getting connections with professional editors and just other ways to kind of develop those skills more. And I think in terms of like the actual, what it was like to kind of put stuff together, it felt like the best the best thing that happened was coming up with the themes, realizing that we could sort of organize the various contributions in some way that kind of made sense and made connections between what might otherwise seem like really different takes.
I was wondering, yeah, the themes are really interesting. So let me just pull out the actual volume. Do you want to talk about the themes a little bit? The book has survival, vengeance, belonging, and betrayal as sort of big themes, yeah.
I mean, I think those themes, and sorry you should jump in, but I think those themes happened organically, right? So the call was for students to twist the fate of, you know, a famous story. So take a famous hero and some of the suggestions were turn the hero into a villain or turn the villain into a hero. And so in reading across all of the entries, really these just end up being the themes that they probably could have been organized a bunch of different ways, but like one conversation was, do we put them, you know, based on, you know, the fandoms, right? So do we put all the Harry Potter stories together? Do we put the, you know, the Alice in Wonderland stories together? And that's one way to do it. But I think reading thematically gives you a different sense of the work and, you know, at the end of the day, the interests of, you know, 13 to 17-year-olds as they were contributing to the volume.
Yeah, and that is maybe a good way to transition into talking about some of the specific ones that we liked. I know that both Christina and I really liked Rumpelstiltskin and his husband. And I liked that story in part because I've never heard a good explanation for why Rumpelstiltskin wanted a firstborn child. Or any child. Like, what was he going to do with that kid? And this is a great explanation of like, well, because he is not allowed to adopt with his husband because of oppressive laws, and so needs to get a kid because they want to be dads. And I just thought that was a great take on, again, a classic tale.
Hey, you're making me realize, I think we're asked to, you know, pick a couple of favorites, but I'm pretty sure as we talk about all of these, they're just going to be a new favorite because they're great, right? And I mean, this points to both the playfulness of it and, you know, the kind of sense making that young people get to make of the world around them and interpretation, which is exciting to me.
And this curation of it within a section about belonging, I think is so interesting too. For me, that adds sort of another layer to this, and then makes me want to think, oh, what are the other belonging stories about? So that's really exciting.
Yeah, and there were a couple that I thought kind of, I can't remember if they're in the same category, honestly, but one of the illustrations, which is the Powerpuff Girls just deciding that this time they're not going to save the city, they're going to destroy it. There was that one, and let's see, what was that one? I know it's up on one of your many tabs. And then there was one where basically the kid from the Onramps,
right? Powerpuffs.
That one's Goblin Queen, but there's another. I can't remember what it's called.
Oh, my sharing might be a little bit behind.
Yes, yeah. Let it burn. So yeah, so they just, this time, nope, they're not going to save the city. And then there was another one where the kid that the Lorax has entrusted with the seed, like, debates about whether people are really worth saving, and decides that they're not, which is such a great twist. And it was a very kind of anti-consumerist, like, looking at all of the ways in which people are sort of tied up with stuff, and kind of liking stuff more than nature, or, you know, that one was really one that struck me as well.
Is that the one, Strings? I'm sorry, it's hard to...
No, Strings is, I chose a bunch of them. Strings,
it's Unless But It Never Happened.
That's the one. Yeah. That's the Lorax. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot. But guess what? That's not what happened.
Yeah, I guess thinking about the Lorax, this makes the stories much more interesting to me, right? This is you just think about the launching pad of you take a story like the Lorax with a group of kids, and the better possibilities I think of what that story can teach and the actual lessons that come from it are really powerful.
Let's see, and there were a few that really seemed to be about how the presence or absence of love makes all of the difference. So the Queer Quill, which is another one that I think we all liked, basically is a super happy story about a really dire villain who was not a villain at all because he has a lovely love life and has been working for the politically progressive causes that he is committed to, and it was just delightful.
And this one's from Harry Potter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Also part of belonging. That's so interesting. I was thinking too, just how some of the drawings too, like just to go back to Powerpuff Girls for a second, they talk about some of the ways that they worked. It's so interesting to also see like that they loved doing it. It was fun. There's commentary with the drawings, and sometimes there are even technical commentaries too, which is so interesting.
Yeah, I'd say so. That's one of those things where I think going back to the Wattpad pieces on that platform is useful because you get similar kinds of comments. But I think for the design of the book, we needed a little bit of the text that went with the DeviantArt submissions. But if you go to Wattpad, you'll see students saying, here's my entry. I had some trouble deciding this. You get a lot of, I think, what we also as adults would say. I wrote this last night, and so it's not the best yet, right? So, or people who are clearly working on stuff and going through revision. But just I really like the kind of maybe paratextual stuff around big ugly academic words, right? But the stuff around the text that helps inform it is interesting.
Yeah, it's so cool. I was also thinking about the fact that when I was reading these stories, I was learning so much about the original text, or realizing how much I didn't know about the original text, or the insights into the original text, like Sarah was just saying with the Rumpelstiltskin one, like, oh yeah, why did?
And actually, that reminds me of one of the conversations we had in the process of figuring out how to curate this. Early on, we thought, should we annotate this? Should we actually identify all of the fandoms and and then we were like, no, there's an internet. People can figure this out. And also a lot of the contributors, they don't need annotations. They don't need to have these worlds explained to them because they already live in them. And so I think that was a really important decision too.
Yeah, I guess, there's a question around, what's it mean to be in a book that is kind of interesting around this, right? Like it's both, probably feels very professionally validating to have your work, and this is the nicest looking book I have on my bookshelf now. Like it looks, the design's amazing, and gold pages, the thing's insane. But also, these are participants of communities that don't really need books either, right? This isn't a critique of the book itself, but just to think about, who is it for, right? So I think as Sarah's saying, we could have done the kind of boring adult thing of explain to other adults why these are important stories, but it's not necessary, right? Like these are stories that stand on their own, and are just as real and authentic as what. So if we think about young adult authors, oftentimes a lot of that work can come out of fan fiction communities, and that those are spaces that people can learn from. And so I see a lot of very porous boundaries that this book and the process around the book kind of pushes against.
I was just back here for a moment too. I think what's so interesting to me, I don't know, just thinking about the physicality too of a book and the virtual nature of this, and then running into pieces that are also physical in nature, like the sculpture here. that also this three-dimensional piece that someone's developing in DeviantArt and sharing in this particular context. So I love that sort of back and forth between material too that you see in this collection.
Well, and I think that's also reflected in kind of our current reality of how cultural content is getting made. A lot of people will be like, I think of all of the webcomics people who they build their audience online, and as they get more known, they start doing conventions, and guess what? They need physical objects to sell at conventions. So they'll do a Kickstarter for a print run for their book, or they'll do prints of their characters or whatever. So there is this connection between the creations that are online and the things that exist physically that is important.
Yeah, that's great. So what are some of the sort of questions this raised for you as you were doing it? Like, what did you, I mean, I think one of the questions you're raising right there is the sort of, what does it mean to make it into a book? I think that's a really provocative question. Are there other questions like that that came up in this process?
I mean, I think that book question gets to the broader question of who is it for, right? Yeah. So maybe a critique of us, right, is, you know, why did a bunch of adults judge this work, right? If it's about, you know, the community, like it could have been you know, youth voting, that could have been one pathway. But I do think there's something about, in some sense, the who is it for, right, of a collection like this is to hopefully spotlight to other adults the ways that fan fiction communities both can play particularly important roles for some young people, and can be centered in the work that we do in libraries and schools and teacher education programs. And so, like, I feel like I don't need to show this book to kids because they hopefully get it if they're of the right, you know, nerdy disposition, right? Like, you know, everyone's interested in different kinds of things. But for adults, it seems like hopefully you can flip through the book and there should be like a light bulb aha moment of building some connections, which maybe we'll talk about in a little bit of, you know, what would this look like in my own classroom, or how could library programming or even spaces in a library support these practices? So maybe that's one way to think about the audience, is to push adults to do better by kids.
Well, and I also feel like, I mean, you could show it to teens and they would want to know, when are we going to do the next one that I can be in? Right. I mean, you know, because it is this beautiful object. And so I'm sure there would also be a sense of like, you know, all these people are in this thing. I would like to be in a thing like this, which might be interesting to think about.
Yeah, for the record, if there is another one, I definitely want to be in it because it's the nicest book.
So multi-generational writers and creators too, so yeah, as well as curators, yes. I was wondering too about the sort of picking it up and kind of the I don't know. I mean, there is a sort of honoring of it in all its glitz, you know, its glitziness. That would be wonderful to think about how to do that same thing in these online spaces. And I know these communities actually run contests all the time. So the ways that thinking about the ways that we could support youth that we're working with and connecting into some of these communities, even if they aren't as geekily dispositioned maybe, but that there are challenges out there that they could try. You know, they don't have to necessarily be fully engaged, but it's kind of a way to try a community or just see what kind of feedback you might get on something from this extended community of peers. And so I also was sort of thinking about it as kind of like some of these contests or this idea of challenges can be a little bit of an on-ramp into something new and supportive of your writing if you haven't been thinking about this in this way.
Yeah, I would just expand a little on that. And I think, yes, not everybody's going to be into twisting heroes and villains in the way that this volume does, but everyone is probably geeky about something, right? And so figuring out ways to, amplify, embrace those passions, right, in classrooms and in informal spaces, does seem not only like something you should do, but seems like a kind of a mandate on, ways we should be engaging kids in general, right? So maybe that means sports, which then I'm in real trouble if most of my kids are into sports, because I don't know what to say there. But there's a larger community of folks who are going to support one another in like the openly networked spaces of classrooms and libraries.
Yeah.
So that seems, yeah.
You said Onramp, and that really made me think about, we've sort of talked about this already, but fandom in general is an on-ramp for creation, because you've got a structure that already exists. So whether that means you're learning to sew so that you can make the costume that's amazing of your favorite character, or you really know that these two characters obviously should have been together and therefore you were going to write that wrong.
Yes.
You've got stuff that, so you don't have to do it all from scratch. And so I think that's one of the really appealing things. And again, we know that there are lots and lots of folks who have started out in fandom communities and become professionals, and which is not to say that everybody has to, but like that is an on-ramp,
Right.
which is great.
I also was thinking, sorry.
Good, Christine, I'm sorry, please.
Well, I was also, it made me think about also how it can be an on-ramp to social action. Because, like when I was a kid, I remember, what's actually original now, but reading Wide Sargasso Sea and realizing it was a rewriting from a different voice of that classic text that I'm now forgetting. But in a similar way, Love Medusa, there's a piece in here that's from Medusa's voice and is like Medusa speaking. And to me, that felt like oh, wow, the power of giving voice to these important, in that case, important female characters in mythology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does seem like, so maybe this goes back to the ways, this volume's organized thematically, right? So if you're really interested in the sense of belonging and can maybe connect with Medusa, maybe that leads you down the road to Big Hero 6, right? And probably goes the opposite way for most kids, right? But you can think about, how you trace into different spaces. I was just going to pick up on, Sarah, you were talking about like sewing and making costumes, and as someone who also goes to comic conventions once in a while, it seems like a space where I remember going as a kid, and it was very much like the ponytail comic book store guy space, and hashtag problematic costumes everywhere. And there's still some of those, right? Like that still happens, but in comic spaces, the diversity of who dresses up and what they dress up as, to me feels, like a really optimistic moment in terms of now more than ever seems like a time where it's great to be nerdy about things, right? Oftentimes it's still Eurocentric visions of fantasy stuff, aka Game of Thrones, but we're in a place where maleness and whiteness aren't always at the center of what fandom means, and even if it's at the center of original stories or of like the canonical stories, it's not often at the center of the relationships that are shipped or the kinds of ways that race is redefined in stories, both in this collection and across all of these platforms.
I was also thinking about the ways that it would be wonderful to hear from the youth involved in this project. And so I think that's why, again, I mean, you mentioned this, Antero, it's like wanting to go back to those communities and sort of hear more from them. I feel like that's something the book really drew me to want to do, flipping through it. I was also thinking about you guys as about ourselves, Antero, when you ourselves as educators, that's to say, when you talked about, but what if this is about sports? Like there's a lot, or if the kids were really geeking out about sports, so there's a lot to learn also in these different communities, right? So not being as up to date at all about popular culture. I just really had to, you know, like Wikipedia and Google everything. Like, what is that reference? What's that story? And just how much I learned looking at this stuff. I'm like, whoa, this is really interesting. And, you know, I can see a whole ton of Harry Potter and I can see a whole ton of classic tales, but all the other stuff, I like barely know it. So for us as educators, it feels like such a wonderful, I mean, we said this, but a learning opportunity in that way. And then thinking about all the other spaces and places that we can continue to learn to support the kids and to find out more from them.
Yeah, you're making me think of, so, you know, I think the first part of this conversation, I've been thinking about these communities, Wattpad and DeviantArt, and the participants in this book as a community that we're learning from, and it's kind of far away, and we go and kind of, maybe it's this like weird anthropological, like go and see the native young people in their wild habitat in worrisome ways, right? But when we think about, you know, how we bring this into local spaces that we actually, you know, on a day-to-day basis interact with young people, those aren't communities that are far away. We might have differences, but all communities are comprised of folks who have differences. And so thinking through, you know, what are the similarities and how can you help me understand, you know, what's happening in sports? Those seem like the opportunities to push on and build and enrich a community. And again, also as the anthropological outsider to the world of sports, right? This seems like an amazing time to kind of figure out ways to think about relationships and what's happening. I'm ready for like the superhero fan fiction of Colin Kaepernick and what's happening. This is just a real opportunity right now of where these spaces are engaged.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about the remix possibilities in that too.
Well, and you were talking about sort of how does this play out in local settings, and I've mostly been talking kind of with my author hat on, but thinking about the way this connects to, you know, like professional writing and comics and whatever. But with my librarian hat on, we actually did something sort of similar to this in my library,
right,
around a visit with Jean Yang, amazing Jean Yang, where we did a comics contest and then put an anthology together in advance. And that was actually based on San Jose has been doing that for years. And I think actually a lot of libraries have done similar things with writing anthologies and more recently comics anthologies. And it does bring up a lot of interesting points about how do you judge it? And what is the basis on which you judge these things?
Yeah.
And, you know, and it led to some really interesting conversations. I remember there being like a story that had really strong art, and then we were concerned about like, maybe it was kind of mean, and like, does that matter? I don't know. But being, you know, and it was just really, again, instructive to try to take on that role of curation and then to just be really thoughtful about what grounds you use.
Yeah, I think that's an important thought and conversation. And I was thinking about it just made me remember how once I was talking with a group of teachers and pre-service teachers, and the subject of fan fiction came up, and we were talking about different ways that kids are remixing content and connecting to larger fan communities. And it was about 45 minutes in before a teacher in the room said, "Oh, I do that." Because, you know, and then it's like, oh, okay, so please, you know, why do you do that? What do you do? We'd love to learn from you. And she said, yeah, it's not the kind of thing I like to bring into my teacher world, because that teacher world is often, you know, full of assessments and full of ways to critique and to judge. And actually this work happens in a larger community of others and doesn't have that kind of, so these lines that she was, well, I mean, my understanding were that she was drawing lines between those two things was just really important. and then, you know, and I wonder how communities themselves do, but the communities themselves do these challenges. So they're obviously, like, people are judging things and thinking about things, and, you know, but they're doing it within a sort of larger community.
Well, and that phrase porous boundaries that we used before, I think that's really, I mean, it's kind of true about everything all the time at this point, but like, we've been talking about these as youth communities, and they're not exclusively youth communities.
Right, good point, yeah.
And so, you know, there may be, like, for one individual user of DeviantArt or Wattpad, they may interact more often with folks around their same age, but maybe not. And maybe some of, you know, maybe that teacher, like, is also on Wattpad and is putting stuff up. And so that's another, I think that's something else that's interesting about this, is that possibility of what we used to say on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog.
Right. Or we could think about the intergenerational possibilities, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
everybody knows you're a dog, and they like the kind of dog that you are. I don't know. Anyway,
as long as you're a rescue dog, it's great. It's all
exactly.
I mean, I think about, yeah, maybe in the past it might have felt taboo to bring in, you know, what is the thing a teacher really likes into your classroom, right? So if you're secretly a Trekkie, right, you don't talk about that, and then heaven forbid, you know, a student finds out. But now, like, these seem like the real opportunities to, you know, sustain stronger relationships, and also to highlight, you know, how and why, you know, you should extend the work you're interested in into the ways that you participate in extracurricular life. So it can be a model for young people to think about. And I think this question of competition is tricky, right? Because at least my when I read in fan fiction spaces, it is a nurturing space, and it is about getting feedback and apprenticeship, right? You see that happen. And I've been talking with adults who've been in fan fiction-y, right? It's fluid spaces for a long time, and they talk about the very real kinds of romantic relationships that have fostered out of that, not intentionally, right? This just happened over, you know, years of writing and communicating in spaces, and non-romantic relationships, right? Just really powerful friendships. And I think those are important to recognize, that this is these are real people, and so it's not just about finding the best of a work, right? But about how that work can speak to even just one person, right? That's something.
Yeah. I think the design of challenges, though, is sort of interesting pedagogically in terms of sort of surfacing kind of a shared energy around something too. And I did hear the folks from Wattpad and DeviantArt talking about the communities in there in that context, and the challenges in those contexts doing that too. But I do think that it speaks to sort of the community, like where you started us, Antero, like a next volume, it would be wonderful to have the youth themselves, you know, co-curate, or, I mean, you guys were in there as, you know, people that the youth would appreciate some feedback from too. I mean, that's, you know, and there was a third curator too, Brian, from
and Lauren.
Yeah. Oh, and Lauren, right. I'm sorry, there were 4. And certainly all of you brought different sort of backgrounds and expertise to this work. But thinking about that sort of the co-curation piece, I think, is really powerful, and potentially even like pedagogically powerful too. So let's see, just because we have some time, should we share some other stuff? I think it's so much fun to look at the work.
Let's see. Well, we sort of briefly looked at Goblin Queen, but that was another one that I liked.
Here, I'll share the screen for that one.
And
Twisted from Labyrinth, it looks like.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me because, like, Labyrinth has been around a while, and it was interesting that that's still speaking to people. And that's actually, I see a lot of Goblin King cosplays at conventions. So and it's not just like people who were around when Labyrinth first came out.
I know, it's David Bowie after all.
But I like the attention to detail in this one, with the costumes and with the little stripy onesie that is actually from the little brother that is claimed by the Goblin King. So it was just, I thought that one was really well done.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. That's good. Christian, I'm going to link one to you because I didn't.
Yep.
Actually, I'll take a second. We should look at another one.
Well, when we're looking, this is one that I found that seemed to be an original piece too, written by two people. So it's also a collaborative project. And it itself was a story about twisting fate and who the hero is and who the villain is, and that gets twisted in the story itself. Or that's how I was reading it. And it's a graphic story. It doesn't include any text. So this was another one that I thought was interesting to actually sort of twist one's own story, and the idea of twist fate itself being a prompt for writing an original story. Okay, I see yours, Tarot.
It's tricky because I think we're going to mainly share visual ones, but you know, a large bulk of this collection is text, and those are
text. Yeah.
I think the queer quill is a really good example of that one. But I like this one. It's also an image, mainly because I always assumed.
Maybe I don't have the right one. Hold on.
No,
sorry.
it's actually, that's how the link's working, which is interesting. So maybe I'll just put it up on my webcam, because it's the others. So basically, it is a I don't know if it'll show up here.
Oh yeah.
So this is the image, which you can't really see very well. But what I really like about it is the text around it basically gives a rereading of Kung Fu Panda, which I must admit I'm just not the biggest fan of Kung Fu Panda. And it turns out like the reframing of what it means to be a villain and how that might be related to parenting and also to, you know, innate identity is, I thought it was fun and playful and made me rethink something I wasn't a big fan of. It's easy for me to like the Harry Potter stuff. Kung Fu Panda had an uphill battle for my own interest in that sense. Or the stuff I think, Christine, you were talking about, like there were texts that you weren't familiar with, and I definitely wasn't familiar with some of these when I was doing some of the reading the first time around. And so that was enlightening.
Yeah, I learned about manga I didn't know about, and you know, a bunch of other things. That was fun. Let's see if we have any more. Great. So what would your sort of suggestions be for your colleagues? So just thinking about the fact that this book has been distributed to libraries all over the country, and that it also was distributed to writing project sites where teachers gather, you know, in workshops and institutes to really think about their practice as writers and then teachers of writing. What are some sort of suggestions you would have for colleagues in thinking about using this book and the related online environments?
Well, I mean, the most obvious thing I can think of is to sort of do the same thing that we did in terms of learning about some of these worlds.
Right.
We're not familiar with them, and thinking about how those might be able to be a springboard for whatever challenges or prompts that they wanted to offer in their own settings.
Yeah, my initial sense is to encourage folks, thinking about adults, to encourage adults to read the book, but I'm also worried about that's so cute thing that happens when adults read or listen to the voices of young people. I would challenge the skeptics in us of whether or not this is real literature to produce something better, right? Like I think jump into Wattpad and jump into DeviantArt and write stuff if you're but I think that's a little beside the point. But really, I think read this as, you know, authored art, right? Either words or painting or sculpture in the one example. But treat this as a text and talk about it, and then think through, you know, how can my classroom, how can my space, you know, do this work? Sarah shared, you know, how the Jean Yang visit kind of inspired her library to do that work. And that just seems like such a useful way to think about what could you do in your classroom, right? Either everyone choosing a fandom, or if we're reading a book, how can students remix the text in that in different ways? Just a lot of obvious ways to jump into this. But I think just looking at this as a model of, all right, here's what some kids did. We can do this. We don't need a fancy designer. It's nice, right, to make the book like this. But there's no reason you can't, you know, produce a large volume like this if every student were to produce something in a mode that they're interested in.
Yeah. I also, that just triggered a memory that I did actually have one that I wanted to share also, because what I thought was interesting about this one, this is one of them that I had to look up. What is Titan? It's a manga collection. But what's interesting is that it was also collaboratively done. So I was thinking about like the power of that, that you saw in these communities and across these communities. You saw artists and writers and illustrators and painters working together. So they were using their skills to collaboratively build projects. So that's another thing that I think is really important to see in the text, is sort of all those ways that this work was actually created. And as you said, going to Wattpad, you might even see more of that in the written pieces too. How did they, you know, think through, what were they thinking through when they were writing these narratives? And those stories of the creator's process seems really interesting. What was the other piece I was thinking about? Oh, well, never mind. It's gone. So, yeah, this is the opportunity of this, I think. Oh, I guess I was thinking about sort of writing the sort of different modes and mediums too. So thinking about it as a text on tarot, the fact that it has so much drawing in it and illustration and art, it feels really important to also consider as a text. And all these pieces as textual pieces that could be written. And also I was thinking about that, like, oh, so cute. Actually, when you read them, they're not, you know, they go into dark places, and they really experiment with, you know, what does it mean to be a villain? What does it mean to survive?
Yeah.
And I think they're incredibly powerful for the sort of the insights that are within them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That there's some really, you know, powerful content and big ideas to grapple with and to talk about here. Yeah,
that's great. All right, well, maybe we could sort of just wrap up with some last thoughts, and then encourage our colleagues to, you know, visit DeviantArt, visit Wattpad, and maybe these are my last thoughts. Go visit DeviantArt, go visit Wattpad, get a sense of those communities, and then check out Twist Fate at Connected Learning Alliance, and you'll be able to download the book and also look for it in your local community. Who wants to go for it next?
I guess I feel like you summed it up. I mean, those would be my recommendations too.
I would just add to those, go make something, right?
Nice.
Go write something, go draw something, go build something, but be productive, right? I think that just seems like a useful push.
Awesome, great. And thank you both as educators, as artists, as curators for your role in this project and for your loving, caring, and expert eye that you brought to all this work too. I think it's a beautiful collection, and I think it's also, you know, a testament to the power of these larger communities that you're connected to. So thank you for bringing what you know about them into this mix.
Thank you. This was fun.
Great. This has been Connected Learning TV at educatorinnovator.org. If you want to sign up to learn about upcoming events, go to educatorinnovator.org and sign up for the newsletter. You can follow blog posts, and you can find us at Twitter at @innovates_ed. Thank you.